Lieutenant General Arthur Percival stood in the operations room at Fort Canning on the evening of February 8, 1942, staring at a tactical map covered with red markers that showed Japanese positions spreading across Singapore Island like a malignant infection that British forces seemed powerless to stop. The markers were everywhere. Across the Johore Strait that was supposed to provide a natural defensive barrier, landing on the northwest coast that intelligence reports had assured him was too difficult to assault, pushing inland faster than any military planning document had predicted possible. Singapore was supposed to be impregnable according to 20 years of British military doctrine and billions of pounds worth of fortifications. Churchill himself had called it the Gibraltar of the East, an unassailable fortress anchored by 15-inch naval guns in concrete emplacements, defended by 70,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops, protected by the greatest concentration of military power the British Empire had deployed east of Suez. But the Japanese were winning systematically and relentlessly. In 7 days, they would capture the entire island in what would become the greatest military humiliation in British history. They would take 85,000 prisoners, the largest surrender of British-led forces ever recorded, and prove that the impregnable fortress had possessed one fatal weakness that British military planners had refused to acknowledge despite explicit warnings. That weakness had been discovered 3 years earlier by a man the British colonial administration had welcomed into Singapore and then completely ignored when he published his findings. A man whose confidential report to Imperial Japanese Army intelligence had predicted everything. Every tactical move, every defensive failure, every assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong. His name was Tsurumi Yōichi, though the British knew him only as a civil engineer from Mitsui Trading Company. In 1940, he hadn't been a general planning invasions. He had been a military intelligence officer with a clipboard and a camera, measuring angles and calculating fields of fire while disguised as a businessman surveying construction sites. He was a spy hiding in plain sight among colonials who couldn't imagine that anyone would challenge British military supremacy in Asia. What Tsurumi wrote in his classified report had been dismissed as fantasy when British intelligence intercepted and translated excerpts 18 months before the invasion. Officers had laughed at his conclusions and called them impossible, insisting that no modern army could attack Singapore from the north through jungle terrain that lacked roads and was considered militarily impassable by every European military doctrine. They were catastrophically wrong. And now, 32 months after Tsurumi completed his reconnaissance, British forces were paying for that arrogant dismissal with the greatest military disaster in their empire's history. But this story doesn't begin with the fall of Singapore in February 1942. It begins in July 1940, in a colonial city that believed itself invincible because it had never seriously examined whether that belief matched reality, with a Japanese intelligence officer who saw weaknesses that everyone else had systematically ignored. On July 12, 1940, Tsurumi Yōichi stepped off a steamship at Keppel Harbor carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a linen suit that was already soaked with sweat despite the early morning hour. The humidity was crushing even by tropical standards. 33 degrees Celsius with 90% humidity that made breathing feel like inhaling through wet cloth while the sun turned the harbor into a glittering furnace. He was officially a civil engineer representing Mitsui Trading Company, traveling to Singapore to survey potential construction sites for commercial development. Roads, bridges, office buildings, infrastructure projects that Japanese firms were increasingly interested in as regional trade expanded. His credentials were impeccable because they were genuine. His references checked out because they were real. The British colonial administration had approved his visa without hesitation or suspicion because Japanese businessmen were common in Singapore and were considered economically valuable. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. He was also Captain Tsurumi of Imperial Japanese Army Intelligence, trained in military engineering and reconnaissance operations, sent on a mission that seemed almost impossible when his commanding officer first briefed him 6 weeks earlier in Tokyo. His assignment was straightforward in concept, but daunting in execution. Survey Singapore's defenses comprehensively, identify exploitable weaknesses in the fortress system, and determine whether the British position could actually be taken by military force, despite 2 decades of fortification efforts and the widespread belief that Singapore was militarily impregnable. The assignment seemed nearly impossible because Singapore was the most heavily defended position in Southeast Asia and possibly in the entire Pacific theater. The British had spent 20 years and billions of pounds creating a fortress complex that military analysts considered second only to Gibraltar in defensive strength. Massive naval guns, concrete fortifications designed to withstand sustained bombardment, artillery batteries covering every approach from the sea, garrison forces larger than many European nations could field. The defenses were formidable by any objective military assessment. But Tsurumi had been trained at the Imperial Army's intelligence school to find impossible opportunities, to see vulnerabilities that others missed through conventional analysis, to understand that every fortress, regardless of strength, possesses weaknesses that become visible when you examine assumptions rather than just studying fortifications. He spent his first week in Singapore establishing his civilian cover story with meticulous attention to detail. He met with British colonial officials to discuss construction projects. He submitted formal proposals for road improvements in the commercial district. He attended social functions at the Colonial Club, where he played the role of eager businessman perfectly, bowing politely, smiling warmly, taking extensive notes about business opportunities, making himself socially invisible through excessive visibility and professional courtesy that made him seem harmless and economically motivated rather than militarily dangerous. Then he began his actual intelligence work with the systematic approach that his training had instilled. On July 19th, Tsurumi hired a car and driver, telling them he wanted to survey the northern part of Singapore Island to identify potential sites for worker housing developments that might support future industrial expansion. The driver was a local Tamil man who drove him along coastal roads past rubber plantations and stretches of dense jungle that seemed impenetrable to someone accustomed to Japan's more managed landscapes. Tsurumi watched everything with trained observational discipline, while appearing to take casual interest in scenery. He made mental notes about distances, calculated terrain features, observed defensive positions, and slowly began to recognize something that shocked him despite his intelligence training. The famous defensive system of Singapore contained a vulnerability so fundamental that he initially assumed he must be misunderstanding what he was observing. The legendary guns of Singapore were positioned exactly as his pre-mission briefings had described. Massive 15-inch naval batteries at Fort Siloso, Fort Connaught, and Johore Battery, weapons capable of hurling 1,900-pound shells across 22 miles of ocean with devastating accuracy. The firepower concentration was extraordinary and would indeed destroy any naval fleet attempting to attack from the southern approaches. But every single gun pointed south toward the ocean and the expected direction of naval attack. Tsurumi had studied the defensive plans through intelligence reports and understood the British strategic thinking. Singapore's defenses were explicitly designed to repel naval assault from the sea. The guns were mounted in fixed concrete emplacements with limited traverse that allowed them to cover southern approaches comprehensively and effectively. But the guns couldn't rotate to point north toward the jungle and the Malayan mainland. They couldn't defend against an attack from an unexpected direction because they were physically incapable of traversing that far from their designed firing arcs. The British had built their fortress to defend against one specific threat scenario and had left alternative approaches essentially undefended because doctrine insisted those approaches were impossible to exploit. Tsurumi felt his pulse accelerate as he recognized the strategic implications. This couldn't possibly be correct. No competent military engineer would design a fortress with such an obvious and exploitable flaw. He must be missing something. Hidden fortifications, secondary defensive lines, artillery positions that weren't immediately visible from his limited reconnaissance. He spent 3 additional days conducting systematic surveys, driving along the entire northern coast while maintaining his civilian cover as a businessman evaluating construction sites. He looked carefully for gun emplacements, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, hardened defensive works that would indicate serious military preparation for defending the northern approaches. He found almost nothing of military significance. The northern shore was defended by thin coastal units with minimal heavy weapons, some barbed wire obstacles that looked more symbolic than effective, a few searchlights for nighttime observation, and essentially nothing that could stop a determined assault by trained infantry with proper planning and preparation. On July 22nd, Tsurumi stopped at a small hill overlooking the Johore Strait that separated Singapore Island from the Malayan mainland. The strait was remarkably narrow at this location, less than 1 kilometer of water that looked more like a river than a significant military obstacle. He could see the mainland jungle clearly across the water. He spent an hour talking with local fishermen who worked the strait, asking casual questions about currents, water depths, tidal variations, and navigation hazards while pretending to evaluate whether the location might support a pier for commercial shipping. The fishermen told him the strait could be crossed easily in small boats, describing sandbars and shallow areas where the water was barely chest deep at low tide. They mentioned that during certain tidal conditions, you could almost walk across in some locations if you knew the underwater topography and didn't mind getting wet. Tsurumi took extensive notes and drew detailed diagrams while calculating crossing times with military precision. A well-organized military force using small boats and rafts could cross the strait in 20 to 30 minutes under favorable conditions. Under cover of darkness with proper preparation and tactical deception, you could land thousands of troops on Singapore Island before British defenders could organize effective resistance or bring artillery to bear on the landing sites. And once troops were across the strait, where would they encounter serious defensive positions? Tsurumi studied the visible fortifications with growing disbelief at what he was discovering. The British had emplaced some artillery along the northern coast, primarily 3-inch guns that were adequate for harassment fire, but inadequate for stopping a major assault. He counted approximately 40 guns defending roughly 25 miles of coastline through careful observation over several days. Simple mathematics revealed the inadequacy that averaged to approximately 1 gun every half-mile of shoreline, with overlapping fields of fire that existed more in theory than in practical defensive reality. Individual guns could be bypassed or suppressed by concentrated assault forces. The defensive line wasn't actually a line at all. It was a series of isolated strongpoints with gaps large enough to drive battalion-sized formations through if you studied the positions carefully and planned your approach intelligently. Compare those northern defenses to the southern fortifications that Tsurumi had observed during his first days in Singapore. The southern approaches were dominated by 9-inch and 15-inch naval guns in reinforced concrete bunkers built 30 meters thick to resist naval bombardment. Overlapping fire zones meant that nothing could approach from the sea without facing concentrated fire from multiple batteries simultaneously. The South was genuinely a fortress in every military sense of the term. The North was barely defended compared to the South, protected more by assumption and doctrine than by actual military capability. The British had made a fundamental strategic decision based on questionable assumptions. They had concentrated their defensive strength against expected threats from the sea, while leaving unexpected approaches essentially open because military doctrine insisted those approaches were impossible to exploit effectively. But why would competent British military engineers make such an apparently obvious strategic error? Tsurumi thought carefully about the question, because understanding British reasoning was as important as identifying British weaknesses. After several days of analysis, he began to understand the logic that had produced the vulnerable defensive configuration. The British weren't incompetent or stupid in any conventional sense. They had reasoned through the defensive problem systematically using established military doctrine. They recognized that southern defenses were strong and northern defenses were comparatively weak. But they believed, based on decades of European military experience, that the jungle terrain north of Singapore made sustained military operations impossible for modern armies that required roads, mechanized transport, and reliable supply lines. They believed correctly that moving 50,000 troops through roadless jungle was extraordinarily difficult. They believed correctly that supplying those troops without established infrastructure was challenging. They believed correctly that maintaining unit cohesion and combat effectiveness in jungle terrain was problematic for armies trained in European warfare. And by Western military doctrine developed through centuries of European warfare, those beliefs were entirely reasonable. European armies couldn't operate effectively in dense jungle without roads. American armies would face similar difficulties. Any military force that depended on trucks, tanks, heavy artillery, and mechanized supply lines couldn't function in terrain lacking infrastructure to support that equipment. But what if an attacking force used completely different operational doctrine? What if soldiers traveled light instead of carrying heavy equipment? What if they carried their own supplies instead of depending on vulnerable supply lines? What if they used bicycles for mobility instead of trucks? What if they planned to live off captured stores rather than extended logistics chains? What if the entire army was specifically trained and equipped for jungle warfare instead of assuming jungle was impassable? Tsurumi understood something British planners apparently didn't. The jungle wasn't an obstacle if you adapted your operational doctrine to exploit it, rather than viewing it as terrain to avoid. The jungle was actually an opportunity disguised as a threat. The British had built a fortress with a critical blind spot and called it invincible because they couldn't imagine anyone approaching the problem using non-European operational concepts. Tsurumi spent 2 additional days studying the famous guns of Singapore with particular attention to their technical capabilities and limitations. He visited Fort Siloso on an official colonial tour that was open to foreign businessmen, taking tourist photographs that were actually intelligence documentation while measuring angles with practiced precision disguised as casual interest. He discovered something that British defenders apparently hadn't considered tactically significant. The massive guns were indeed fixed in concrete emplacements designed specifically for coastal defense against naval targets. They had limited traverse, allowing maybe 30 degrees of rotation left or right from their primary firing axis. They could elevate for range adjustment when engaging ships at different distances, but they couldn't rotate to point inland toward potential land-based threats. The guns that made Singapore supposedly impregnable against naval attack were completely useless against land assault from the north. The fortifications were magnificent examples of military engineering optimized for one specific threat scenario. They were also examples of strategic inflexibility that created vulnerability when the threat materialized from an unexpected direction. Tsurumi documented everything with careful attention to detail that would prove invaluable when planning the actual invasion 18 months later. After 5 weeks of systematic reconnaissance conducted with meticulous attention to operational security, Tsurumi compiled his findings into a comprehensive intelligence report that would become one of the most strategically significant documents produced during the entire Pacific War. The report was 93 pages of densely detailed analysis, organized into 7 major sections covering every aspect of Singapore's defensive system and exploitable vulnerabilities. Section 1 documented defensive positions with precision that would prove invaluable during operational planning. Tsurumi had mapped every artillery battery he could observe, noting weapon types, apparent ammunition storage locations, fields of fire, blind spots in coverage, and estimated garrison strengths based on observed activity patterns. He included hand-drawn diagrams showing exact positions referenced to landmarks that could be identified from maps or aerial reconnaissance. Section 2 analyzed artillery capabilities in technical detail that demonstrated his military engineering training. He documented the 15-inch naval guns at Fort Siloso, Fort Connaught, and Johore Battery, their traverse limitations, their elevation ranges, their approximate rates of fire based on observed crew sizes. He noted that these weapons were optimized exclusively for engaging naval targets at sea and were essentially useless against land-based threats from unexpected directions. He estimated that even if crews attempted to use the guns against land targets by improvising firing solutions, the concrete emplacements physically prevented traverse sufficient to engage targets north of the fortress positions. Section 3 provided garrison strength estimates based on systematic observation of troop movements, barracks capacity, and supply delivery patterns. Tsurumi had spent hours watching troop formations during their daily routines, counting personnel, identifying unit insignia when possible, and estimating overall force size through multiple independent observation methods. His estimate of 70,000 total garrison strength would prove remarkably accurate when compared to actual British deployment records. Section 4 contained detailed terrain analysis that would become the foundation for operational planning. Tsurumi described the Johore Strait with specificity that could only come from direct observation and extensive conversations with people who knew the water intimately. He documented crossing sites, tidal patterns, water depths at various times and locations, underwater obstacles, favorable landing beaches, and approaches that offered concealment from defensive positions. He identified 6 specific crossing sites where small boats could land troops safely under darkness with minimal risk of detection before forces were ashore in strength. Section 5 assessed infrastructure in ways that revealed how thoroughly Tsurumi understood logistics and operational planning. He documented road networks, railway lines, water supply systems, electrical power generation and distribution, telephone and telegraph communications, fuel storage facilities, and ammunition dumps. He identified which infrastructure was essential for defensive operations and which could be safely bypassed or destroyed to disrupt British coordination without affecting Japanese offensive capabilities once the island was secured. Section 6 analyzed the psychological and political dimensions that professional intelligence officers understood were as important as physical capabilities. Tsurumi assessed colonial morale, relationships between British commanders and Indian or Australian troops, civilian attitudes toward colonial government, and potential vulnerabilities in command cohesion during sustained combat. He noted that colonial confidence in Singapore's impregnability might become a psychological weakness if that confidence was shattered suddenly through unexpected attacks that defensive doctrine insisted were impossible. Section 7 contained the most important conclusions and recommendations that would shape operational planning when invasion became a serious possibility. Tsurumi's key conclusion was stated with clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Singapore could be taken through land assault from Malaya using operational doctrine adapted to jungle warfare. The fortress was not impregnable despite British confidence. The defensive system had a fatal weakness. An attacking force using appropriate tactics could exploit that weakness systematically with high probability of success if command was willing to abandon European military doctrine and embrace operational concepts designed specifically for tropical conditions. Tsurumi recommended specific tactical approaches that would prove devastatingly effective when implemented. Use bicycle infantry for rapid mobility through terrain where trucks couldn't operate. Carry minimal supplies and plan to capture British stores rather than maintaining extended supply lines through jungle. Attack at night when defensive fire is less effective and command coordination is more difficult. Cross the Johore Strait at multiple points simultaneously to divide defensive responses and create confusion. Bypass strong points rather than attacking them directly. Move continuously to maintain operational tempo that British forces couldn't match. Exploit psychological impact of appearing where doctrine insisted you couldn't be. The report concluded with a timeline estimate that would prove prophetic in its accuracy. Tsurumi calculated that properly trained forces using recommended tactics could complete the Malayan campaign and capture Singapore in approximately 60 to 70 days from the initial landing in northern Malaya. The actual campaign took 70 days from landing to surrender. Tsurumi's estimate was correct within acceptable margins for strategic planning. Tsurumi submitted his report through intelligence channels when he returned to Tokyo in late August 1940. The report was classified at the highest level and distributed to a very limited group of senior officers involved in strategic planning for potential operations against British and Dutch colonial possessions in Southeast Asia. Among the recipients was Lieutenant General Yamashita Tomoyuki, who would eventually command the invasion force that proved every prediction in Tsurumi's report correct with devastating precision. Yamashita studied the report carefully and recognized its strategic value immediately. When planning for the Malayan campaign began in earnest during 1941, Tsurumi's intelligence became the foundational document that shaped operational concepts and tactical approaches. The invasion of Malaya and Singapore unfolded almost exactly as Tsurumi's report had outlined with precision that demonstrated how thoroughly his intelligence work had prepared Japanese forces for the campaign. Japanese forces advanced rapidly down the Malayan Peninsula using bicycles for mobility exactly as Tsurumi had recommended, covering distances that British commanders considered impossible for infantry without motorized transport. Soldiers carried minimal equipment and lived off captured supplies systematically, eliminating the vulnerable supply lines that European doctrine insisted were essential for sustained operations. British forces fell back repeatedly because their defensive doctrine assumed mechanized warfare conducted on roads with established supply lines, while Japanese forces maneuvered through jungle terrain that British training had taught them to avoid. Each defensive position that British commanders established became flanked when Japanese units simply moved around strong points through terrain that doctrine insisted was impassable. The psychological impact was devastating as British confidence in their defensive capabilities eroded with each unexpected attack from directions their training insisted were impossible. On February 8, 1942, precisely 19 months after Tsurumi completed his reconnaissance in Singapore, Japanese forces were positioned along the Johore Strait exactly where Tsurumi's report had identified favorable crossing sites. Lieutenant General Yamashita commanded the invasion force and had studied Tsurumi's intelligence so thoroughly that he could recite key passages from memory. The assault plan followed Tsurumi's recommendations almost point by point. Japanese forces crossed the Johore Strait after nightfall, using small boats, rafts, and improvised flotation devices that Tsurumi had suggested would be adequate for the short crossing. They landed at multiple points simultaneously on the northwest coast, where Tsurumi's maps had shown defensive positions were weakest and gaps in coverage were largest. The crossings occurred exactly where Tsurumi had documented favorable landing beaches with concealment from British observation posts. British defenders attempted to resist, but were overwhelmed by forces appearing from unexpected directions with coordination that defensive planning hadn't anticipated. Artillery fire was ineffective because Japanese forces moved continuously and attacked at night when defensive fire was less accurate. The thin coastal units that were supposed to defend 25 miles of shoreline couldn't concentrate forces quickly enough to stop penetrations that occurred at 6 different crossing sites within 2 hours. The famous guns of Singapore, the massive 15-inch naval batteries that were supposed to make the fortress impregnable, remained completely silent throughout the invasion because they couldn't traverse to engage land targets approaching from the north. The weapons that had cost millions of pounds to install and that represented the pinnacle of British coastal defense engineering were absolutely useless against the attack that actually occurred. Crews could do nothing but watch as Japanese forces pushed inland through defensive positions that had been optimized for the wrong threat direction. British commanders attempted to establish new defensive lines inland from the coast, but Japanese forces maintained operational tempo that prevented effective reorganization. Every attempt to establish a defensive position was flanked by forces moving through terrain that British doctrine still insisted was too difficult for coordinated military operations. The psychological impact of being constantly outmaneuvered was as devastating as the tactical defeats. The fortress that was supposed to withstand months of siege fell in 7 days of fighting that demonstrated how completely British assumptions had been wrong. 70,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops surrendered on February 15, 1942, in what Churchill later described as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history. The surrender ceremony was photographed, and those images were distributed throughout Asia as propaganda, demonstrating that European colonial powers could be defeated decisively by Asian military forces. Lieutenant General Percival surrendered on February 15, 1942, in a meeting that was photographed and distributed throughout Asia as evidence that European colonial powers could be defeated. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Singapore's fall demonstrated that British military supremacy in Asia was not inevitable, and that colonial empires could be challenged successfully. The intelligence that made the victory possible came from Tsurumi's reconnaissance work in 1940. His systematic observation, careful analysis, and willingness to question established assumptions had identified vulnerabilities that British military planners refused to acknowledge. His report proved that intelligence and analysis could be more valuable than firepower when properly applied to strategic planning. But there's an additional layer to this story that makes the disaster even more tragic and the intelligence failure even more inexcusable. British signals intelligence had actually intercepted and partially decoded Japanese military communications that included substantial excerpts from Tsurumi's report approximately 6 months before the invasion began. A signals intelligence unit stationed in India had been monitoring Japanese military radio traffic as part of routine surveillance of potential adversary communications. In August 1941, intercepts included encoded transmissions discussing operational planning for potential campaigns in Southeast Asia. British cryptanalysts working with primitive decoding equipment and limited understanding of Japanese military communications managed to decode approximately 30% of the intercepted traffic. Among the decoded portions were extended excerpts from Tsurumi's intelligence report discussing Singapore's defensive vulnerabilities in explicit detail. The decoded intelligence explicitly described Singapore's northern defenses as inadequate to stop determined assault. The intercepts mentioned specific crossing sites along the Johore Strait that Tsurumi had identified as favorable for amphibious operations. The intelligence described British defensive doctrine as overly focused on naval threats while neglecting land-based approaches through jungle terrain. Most significantly, the intercepts stated clearly that Japanese operational doctrine differed fundamentally from European military assumptions, and that tactics considered impossible by Western standards might prove effective when implemented by forces specifically trained for tropical warfare. British intelligence officers in India recognized the strategic significance of these intercepts and forwarded comprehensive summaries through proper channels to military headquarters in Singapore and to Theatre Command in Delhi. The intelligence summaries arrived at Fort Canning in Singapore during September 1941, approximately 3 months before the invasion would begin. The summaries were marked as high-priority intelligence, requiring command-level attention and immediate assessment for potential defensive adjustments. The summaries explicitly warned that Japanese forces were conducting detailed reconnaissance of Singapore's defenses and were planning potential assault operations from northern approaches through Malayan jungle. The warnings stated that Japanese operational planning assumed jungle terrain could be traversed by properly trained and equipped infantry forces using non-standard mobility methods, including bicycles. The intelligence noted that Japanese planners believed Singapore's northern defenses were vulnerable and that the famous coastal artillery couldn't defend against land assault from unexpected directions. British commanders in Singapore received these intelligence warnings and held staff meetings to assess their implications and determine whether defensive preparations required modification. The meetings involved senior officers from British, Indian, and Australian units, along with colonial administration officials who had responsibility for civilian evacuation planning if military operations threatened Singapore directly. The commander's response to the intelligence was dismissive to a degree that would seem incomprehensible in retrospect, when the invasion proved every warning accurate. Officers argued that the intelligence must represent Japanese disinformation designed to cause unnecessary alarm or force wasteful redeployment of defensive forces away from the actual threat axis. They insisted that the intercepts probably reflected wishful thinking by Japanese planners rather than realistic operational planning based on serious analysis. Senior commanders maintained that modern armies absolutely could not sustain major operations through Malayan jungle without established road networks and reliable supply lines. They cited decades of European military experience, demonstrating that mechanized forces required infrastructure that simply didn't exist in primary jungle. They argued that even if Japanese forces somehow managed to reach the Johore Strait through jungle approaches, the defensive positions along the northern coast would stop any attempted crossing, or at minimum would delay assault forces long enough for reinforcements to contain any penetration. Most fundamentally, British commanders expressed confidence that 2 decades of fortification had created defensive systems that couldn't be overcome by infantry assault, regardless of approach direction. They believed that firepower advantages and prepared defensive positions would defeat any attack, even if Japanese forces temporarily achieved tactical surprise through unexpected maneuvers. They trusted that British, Indian, and Australian troops were professionally superior to Japanese forces and would prevail in any sustained engagement, regardless of initial tactical situations. The defensive plan wasn't modified substantively based on the intelligence warnings that later proved completely accurate. No significant reinforcements were deployed to northern defensive sectors that Tsurumi had identified as vulnerable. No additional fortifications were constructed to defend against land assault from directions that doctrine insisted were impossible to exploit. No serious consideration was given to repositioning artillery to provide coverage of northern approaches or to developing contingency plans for defending against attacks that British doctrine couldn't accommodate conceptually. The massive naval guns remained pointed south exclusively because doctrine and institutional certainty insisted that's where the threat would materialize, regardless of what intelligence intercepts suggested. Command decisions reflected confidence in established military doctrine rather than willingness to adapt based on contradictory evidence from intelligence sources. The fortress mentality that Singapore was impregnable prevented serious consideration that the fortress might be vulnerable if enemies attacked using methods that doctrine didn't anticipate. When the actual invasion began in December 1941, British forces fought bravely, but were repeatedly outmaneuvered by Japanese forces using tactics that British doctrine insisted were impossible. The retreat down Malaya became increasingly chaotic as commanders realized too late that their assumptions about jungle warfare were fundamentally wrong. By the time Japanese forces reached the Johore Strait in early February 1942, the outcome was essentially predetermined. The defenses that were supposed to make Singapore impregnable had been optimized for the wrong threat. The intelligence that could have prevented the disaster had been dismissed as impossible. The fortress fell exactly as Tsurumi had predicted it would 19 months earlier. Tsurumi himself survived the war and lived until 1989, dying at age 77 in Kyoto. His role in planning the Singapore operation remained classified for decades. When Japanese military archives were finally opened to researchers, historians discovered his report and recognized it as one of the most significant intelligence documents of the Pacific War. British military historians studying the fall of Singapore eventually acknowledged that the disaster was caused by strategic failures rather than tactical incompetence. British forces fought effectively given their situation, but the situation itself was created by flawed assumptions and dismissed intelligence warnings. The fortress was indeed impregnable from the south, but the attack came from the north exactly as Tsurumi's report had predicted. The lesson from Singapore isn't that intelligence always prevents disasters or that warnings are always heeded. Organizations often dismiss warnings that contradict established doctrine or challenge comfortable assumptions. The British didn't ignore Tsurumi's intelligence because they were stupid. They ignored it because accepting it would require admitting that 2 decades of fortification had optimized defenses for the wrong threat. The lesson is that assumptions matter more than capabilities in strategic planning. The British had enormous military capability in Singapore, 70,000 troops, massive artillery, extensive fortifications. But those capabilities were positioned based on assumptions about how attacks would occur. When the actual attack violated those assumptions, the capabilities became irrelevant. The lesson is also that doctrine can become dogma that prevents adaptation to reality. British military doctrine insisted that modern armies required roads and mechanized transport. That doctrine was based on European experience and was correct for European conditions. But doctrine applied inflexibly to different conditions becomes a vulnerability rather than wisdom. Tsurumi's intelligence proved that systematic observation combined with willingness to question assumptions can reveal strategic vulnerabilities that conventional analysis misses. He didn't discover anything that British engineers didn't already know factually. They knew the guns pointed south, knew the northern defenses were thin, knew the jungle separated Singapore from Malaya. But Tsurumi questioned the assumption that those facts made Singapore secure, while British planners accepted the assumption without rigorous testing. The fall of Singapore demonstrated that impregnable fortresses become vulnerable when defenders cannot imagine attacks from unexpected directions. The greatest defensive weakness isn't physical, it's psychological. The inability to seriously consider that enemies might approach problems differently creates blind spots that intelligence and weapons cannot compensate for. Remember Tsurumi Yōichi, the intelligence officer who saw what British military planners refused to acknowledge. Remember his report that predicted disaster 19 months before it occurred. Remember the warnings that were dismissed because they contradicted doctrine. Remember that Singapore fell not because British defenses were weak, but because British assumptions were wrong and institutional certainty prevented adaptation to contradictory evidence. That is the complete accounting of the prophet who predicted the fall of Singapore and the fortress that fell because doctrine mattered more than reality.